I am Nat, and I am the head of community at Exceptional Individuals. We support neurodiverse individuals to be their best and to get recognition for their amazing skills and support the things that some of us might find a bit more challenging. And every single Thursday, we deliver these free or very low cost webinars that are open to everyone in the world. And we try to tackle subjects which maybe aren't getting enough exposure. And today we thought, all right, let's do a difficult one: how to get a diagnostic assessment. Now, a bit of a disclosure. I know we've got an international audience today, and I do my absolute best to make sure that it's as applicable and as useful as it possibly can be. But do know that because this subject does require you to be a bit more exact with the details, I am going to be coming at it from a UK perspective, but I will make sure to pinpoint the parts which are UK exclusive and ones that might be slightly different depending on where you are in the world. Now, today we are mainly going to be focusing on dyslexia, dyspraxia, autism, and ADHD, but do know that if you have one of the more niche ones, such like dyscalculia, dysgraphia, we are going to briefly mention where you might go to get them. There's less information available for them though, and a lot of the time, as long as you have a diagnostic for one, maybe the benefits for the others, if you have multiple, will be the same. It's like I have multiple neurodivergences, but honestly, when I need to get support or help that requires proof, I just show them one, whichever one I have available, and normally that covers the basis. So, how to get a diagnostic assessment. This is an official bit of a paper which says, you, my friend, you are neurodivergent. But obviously it will not say that. It will say something like, you have autism spectrum disorder, attention deficit hyperactive disorder, dyslexia, and so on. Now, this is our team, and I always like to point out that we are neurodiverse. About 85% of our entire team are neurodiverse, and the vast majority of us are diagnosed. Now, whether or not at the end of this you think getting a diagnostic assessment is the right path for you, well, that's up to you. There's pros and cons, and I think you'll realize as we go along today, it really depends on your situation and circumstances. It may not always be the right decision for you. But with that in mind, let's see what we have on offer. Our last webinar that was edited and uploaded is now live, so do check it out. We did it on the future of neurodiversity. So where are we heading? It's been 100 years or so since we've been publicly talking about it and writing papers and reports. It's an interesting topic. So do check this out. You just go on YouTube and type Exceptional Individuals. Fingers crossed we should come up. So why would you want to get an assessment? This is a question that I want to open to all of you to answer. And remember, today, I don't get paid for doing assessments. It's not directly what Exceptional Individuals does. So we are going to be as neutral as we possibly can be. So pros, cons, maybe you just want one, maybe you need one, maybe it's like for official documentation or government. I would love to know what would be the motivation. Now, if you are neurodiverse or suspect to be neurodiverse, please share from your perspective. If you are not and you support other people, maybe share views from their perspective. So we've got to determine if you have a certain type of neurodiversity. Yeah, sometimes we like a bit of proof. Explain how I process stuff and learn, interested to find more about my needs. Sometimes we do it for our own well-being. It helps make sense of our life and circumstances. To have employers believe you when applying for jobs. Oh, I thought this was going to come up. In an ideal world, you shouldn't need to do it for your employer. Unfortunately, we don't live in that world. So yeah, better understanding, get support, understand my brain, get more support, be registered disabled. And we are going to be talking about that. Spoiler, being neurodiverse is disabled, officially in the UK at least. Whether or not that's how you resonate, maybe you approach that, whether or not you want that label, because ultimately today we are talking about labels, even though not many of us actually like labels, but we do appreciate that sometimes they're a necessary must in order to get help. Name the baby, aka all the things I cannot explain easily to others to put into one word. Yeah, I think that's a really good way actually of saying it. get support. I've struggled at work, and when I read about my symptoms, I feel similarity with those who have ADHD. So I'm wondering if I have this or something similar. Yeah, I guess it can make you feel part of a community, a sense of belonging, if there is something which kind of unites you all. Relate to neurodiverse child, to be a role model. That's really nice. So yeah, maybe your child is neurodiverse and you think, well, let's be honest, it's hereditary. I probably am. If I can say confidently that I am neurodiverse, maybe they can look up to me. Because I'm intrigued and I've been told I've got a learning difficulty, but I've not been told what. Yeah, when you get told you've got a learning difficulty, it's so vague. How are you meant to help yourself if you just put how to help learning difficulties? Oh yeah, and April rightly mentioned that the Future of Neurodiversity webinar was done a while ago, but we had a bit of a backlog, but we are doing our new ones uploaded nearly every week. Okay, great. So we now know why a lot of us would like to have an assessment. A lot of reasons. Some of us are personal and some of ours are necessity. So why have a diagnostic assessment? I appreciate this slide has a lot of text. It was boring. I wasn't able to simplify it too much, but let me break it down for you. So it can help parents to understand their children's difficulties and know how best to help them at home, or able to ask for a more targeted support within the education system. And unfortunately, the education system, they've got their hands full, they're not going to help everyone, even though they probably should. Sometimes having proof can really help push things along, particularly if your child is struggling. But this can also help with your own self. Maybe you would like to know it just so you understand how your brain works. It can also be used to support applications for exam access arrangements. This should be discussed with your school/college first, as assessors cannot complete a Form 8 without the school completing Part A in advance. This is really particular to the UK, but maybe there's a similar approach. Maybe there's a similar approach wherever you are. So what do we mean by exam access arrangements? Well, when you want to have, say, 25% extra in an exam, or you want to have a support person or a scribe in school, university, college, they are a stickler for it and they will not take you for your word. I personally don't agree with that, but that's how it is. So you have to get proof, but you have to speak to the school first. So they need to say, yeah, we agree that you can get support if you have it. It's just the way it is. A lot of university students, for example, who need the help, who had help in school, do not get the help in university just because they're not able to prove in a way that is acceptable to that education establishment. So if you are doing it, say for education or work, make sure that the assessment you get is approved by those individuals. Because as you will see, not all assessments are equal, and some are more valid and have more kind of gravitas than other statements. Okay, students in higher education will need an assessment in order to apply for disability student allowance. Yeah, in the UK, you essentially get a little bit of extra funding if you are officially disabled. And this is why I mentioned earlier that yes, you are officially disabled if you are registered neurodivergent. You may not like that title, but that title can open you up to additional support, such as disabled student allowance. So some might find it essentially what I'm saying, and I do appreciate that we're not all in a circumstance where we're able to be as picky with jobs, but if you do have that privilege, then I would execute it. And lastly, if you have it, you are officially covered under the UK Equality Act. Now, not all countries have equality acts, which is a real shame, but there are a lot that do. And for those, the Equality Act basically says legally an organization or entity cannot discriminate against you for having a neurodivergence. Now, in practice, does that actually work? Well, you tell me. I think, it's not always, but the fact that you are covered can be beneficial and it can at least help. So, Equality Act. What is the Equality Act? And again, apologize, this is UK centric, but bear with us just for a little bit. The Equality Act came into force in 2010. And all of these things, age, disability, gender, race, sexual orientation, religion, marriage, are all protected characteristics. So if you have an employer which says, yeah, you can't work here because you're dyslexic, or I'm not going to help you, or you should be able to do this, I don't care about autism, that's discrimination. And then you can sue them. Now, I'm not saying you should sue people because you normally come off worse for it. You know, the man always wins. But just knowing that it's your right sometimes can be enough of a persuasion tactic in order to get the help you need. I really hope none of you are doing this in order to get the help, and you would not get the help otherwise, but let's be realistic. So yeah, now we know about the Equality Act. We need to know what actually counts as being neurodiverse or a registered disability. And this is really crucial because depending on what the definition is, depending on whether or not you get help. We know that neurodiversity, dyslexia, dyspraxia are labels, and we know labels are created by human beings. And we know that human beings do not always agree with each other. So it's important to know, where is the definition that we're using coming from, and does it relate to the organizations that we needed to prove ourselves to almost? So to start off with, the most common one that most people are familiar with is the DSM. And this is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, V5. And when you Google, like, you know, what is a disability, what is dyslexia, typically the DSM is what comes up. But I would just like to make it really clear that this is predominantly America, okay? A lot of other countries use it, but in Europe and the UK predominantly, we do not use this. And if you look at the UK version, which I'll get to in a minute, and this version, they're very similar. There's a lot of overlaps, but the wording is slightly different. So you want to be careful. For example, Asperger's, which is now ASD, is in both of them, was in the DSM-5 ASD before the UK one. And you just got to be careful. So this is for America. The ICD-11 is for the UK. Now, typically the world, I don't know every country, but typically they'll use one of these. So if you're part of the World Health Organization, like one of those like member states, typically you'd use the ICD. If you're in North America, typically you'd use the DCM. Sorry, so many acronyms, but you get the point. Honestly, do not bother reading this. It's too damn long, but maybe just read the section or the part that relates to you. Now, I want to talk about where, you know, some of you mentioned about getting a diagnosis and how to do it for free. One of the biggest questions I get is, will the NHS cover it? And again, this is related to the UK. And I hate to say it, no, they might cover it, but they may not. And some things they do, some things they do not. So the general rule of thumb is splitting up neurodivergence into 3 categories. You've got applied neurodivergence, and that's things like dyslexia, dyspraxia, dysgraphia. And those are things which, are things that might like apply to real life. It's hard to define. But then you have things that are clinical, and these are things that you can go to the GP about, maybe autism, ASD, ADHD. So applied neurodivergences, the NHS will not cover. Maybe there are a few examples of when they have, but 9 times out of 10, they will not cover it. So you have to go private or find other means of doing it. But if you think you have ADHD or autism, then definitely go to the GP, because they might be able to put you on, allow you to go through the NHS, which will cover it. But before I send all the people who think they might be dyslexic away, I would say if you're not 100% sure, still go to your GP, because sometimes qualities of dyslexia, for example, might actually be ADHD and you might not know. So it's still, sometimes the doctor will be like, they'll be honest, they're like, okay, you need to go elsewhere for this, or actually what you're telling me sounds more like autism than it does dyspraxia, for example. So this is why try not to diagnose yourself if you aren't 100% sure, just because you might be missing out on the correct support as well as the free support. And lastly, we've got acquired neurodivergence. Now, these aren't things that we specialize in as an organization, but they are important to be aware of. And these are things that you can develop in life. So these things you can gain, where the others are things that you are typically born with. So this could be mental health conditions, PTSD, anxiety, depression, and these are things you can go to the GP about. You wouldn't necessarily get such a thing as like, here's a bit of paper diagnosing you, but they are also related to being neurodivergent and are also covered under the Equality Act. So remember, all these things do count as being neurodivergent. And now I'm going to give different examples on the 4 most prevalent neurodivergences on different ways that people have been assessed, the pros, the cons, and hopefully by the end of the day, you'll have an idea on whether or not it's something that you're interested in or you want to investigate a little bit further. Now, some of you I know are autistic, or maybe some of you have children that are autistic, or you support people who are autistic. And I'd love to know your experience on accessing an autism assessment, because we have already mentioned that in the UK, at least, autism is covered under the NHS. So in theory, most of you would have had it that way, but maybe for whatever reason, some of you did it private. Maybe you found it a really easy process, went in next week, got a bit of paper, or it took several years to kind of get to this point. So yeah, please do share, because one thing we will know today is that there isn't one simple route in order to get a diagnostic assessment. There's many approaches. Okay, I'm in the process of waiting for my GP to refer me via right to choose for an ASD assessment. Oh, great. And GPs, it's a long wait. We will get onto this as well, but do not expect this to be a fast process. Even if you go private, it can take a long time, but going through the GP can take a really long time. I think for myself, I was like 2 or 3 when I was diagnosed. And between 3 and 4 is the average age to be diagnosed with autism, which is really interesting because it's such a young age, but it does mean you can get the support. Now, where that might sound a good thing, those of us who get missed in the system and want to get diagnosed later in life, that can be a lot harder, and you might have to go a different route. Because just bear in mind that GPs, as amazing as they are, and I love them, they are not experts in autism. They're generalists. ASD under right to choose is 15-week wait, local NHS 2-year wait. 2 years. Heard it's difficult, and once referred, still taking a long time to get appointment for assessed as an adult. Yeah, no one said this was going to be an easy approach. Took years for child, girl. Noticed differences at 2, took until 6.5 years. And that is a real thing. There is a gender difference. Boys are more likely to get diagnosed sooner just because of the way they demonstrate their characteristics. IAS, long process, not price. All the assessments are pretty rare and cost a lot. Waited 7 years with the NHS and ended up going privately. Oh, God. A child psychiatrist diagnosed my brother and me with autism when we were 2 and I was 4. Yeah, that is a very common approach. It's interesting because some of you are such regulars. I know who asks what question now. It's nice. It's easier for a child to be referred, but as an adult, GPs tend to ignore the signs even when requested. Well, what they typically do is it's actually very difficult to get diagnosed. What they have to do for autism and ADHD is rule out any other possible option first. So it's not the first port of call to have an assessment, it's actually the last. So if they have any doubt that they think it might be something else, then they will leave it on the back burner until they are more confident. Why? Maybe to ease pressure, but it unfortunately, a lot of people do go amiss. The vast majority of the people we support, exceptional individuals, are not officially diagnosed and just resonate. But you tell me whether or not that's right or not. I asked my GP, they got extremely confused. It took 14 months until my referral got to the right place. Learning disability team. Now it will be 6 to 8 months. Most people get stuck at commissioning before even getting to the diagnostic part. Okay, I'm sensing a bit of frustration among all of us, probably rightly so. Grandson diagnosed at 3 via panel of SALT Ed Psych paramedics at CAMHS. Oh, interesting. So a lot of you have mentioned that it is a pain in the butt, to say the least, to get diagnosed as an adult. But why? And it's because a lot of GPs are not qualified or not experts in autism. I'm not saying they don't know anything, but they do not know everything. And their basic understanding of autism is that autism looks in a child, particularly a boy. So what does it look like in adults? I'd love your comments, like just share the words. Is there anything which makes autism particularly hard to spot in adults? And maybe if we know what the GP may be missing, maybe if we tell them, it might help. I mean, do not go to them and act like you're a know-it-all, but sometimes mentioning things that they may have overlooked can be really useful. Here we got aloof, masking, depression, quiet, camouflaged, suppressed. And I think you all got it. This is kind of a trick question. Autism can not really look like anything, because you've spent your whole life camouflaging yourself, masking, pretending to fit in with the norm. It's when you go into a doctor's surgery and you just kind of drop the act, you might feel like an imposter, like a fraud, or he might not even know how to do it. You know, we can act, but we're still struggling underneath. And it's sometimes it's difficult to remember when you started this kind of facade and when it's just part of you. So the signs and the characteristics, the symptoms, all of that are a lot more subtler in adults. Yeah, perfectionist, control freak, distance, antisocial. Yeah, all of these things are a sign, but you also know that they're also a sign for a lot of other things. Could be personal preference, could be anxiety disorder, could just be shy. There's so many different reasons. And remember what I said, they will only diagnose you if they do not think it is anything else. They have to be pretty confident it's autism. So all of these does not equal autism. They equal a number of different potential conditions. So now we know why it's difficult to get diagnosed as an adult. We might be able to push it in the right direction a little bit. Now, for those of you who had assessment or those who have had an assessment, where's your kind of feelings on it? Was it quite a positive experience? Was it like neutral, or did you have a negative experience? And again, I am not here to drive any particular narrative. It's more to educate those who might be looking into having one about whether or not this is something they would like to pursue. Okay, so the vast majority of you have said neutral. And, interestingly enough, those who have had an assessment, most of them have had very positive things to say. The wait is awful, but the actual process is pretty good, nice, easy. I've got nothing negative to say about it myself from a personal perspective. Any negativity comes from the wait, not from the actual experience. It's just really a conversation, playing a couple of games. It's not too stressful. The next one on autism, before we move on, is do you feel autism assessments are age appropriate? And this is saying, do you think they're best suited for children? Do you think they work the same? They're universal, people are people. Or do you think they're made for adults? April says, I chose natural a neutral because I can't actually remember my diagnostic assessment, but I remember having autism from childhood. I'm the same. I have vague memories of it, but I just remember them mainly talking to my mum. Typically, they'll talk to your teacher, they'll talk to your parents, they'll just observe you. So you might not have such a direct impact, but obviously adults will. So the majority of people have said best suited for children, and the others have said it works for both. And my thoughts is it's best suited for children, just because when they were like obviously coming up with the list of what counts as autism, it was on the lens of for children. For many years, we didn't even think adults could be autistic. We didn't even think, so that's my reasoning. Now, obviously, there's more awareness now, but the majority of the people who assess for autism will typically have their experience rooted in children rather than adults. I'm not saying it's going to be wrong, but it's worth to know. So just keep that at the back of your mind. Like if you go to a private person for an assessment, maybe you want to ask them, what's your experience of working with adults? Because if all their experience is working with children, maybe they're not the best person for you to take you on this journey. The next question is very similar. How do you feel autism assessments are? Do you feel that autism assessments are gender appropriate? So do you think that they're best suited for males? Do you think that it doesn't matter? Or do you think they're best suited for females? And best suited for males, yeah, and I hate to say it, best suited for males. Again, because when the assessments was really originally created, when the initial research for autism was being undertook, it was for white male boys. And even though the kind of like systems that we use to diagnose autism now have changed and being updated, they're still missing out on a lot of tricks. For instance, females tend to be more introverted, they tend to be more passive, they tend to camouflage and mask at a much earlier age. And as such, they're not going to show the characteristics which need to be ticked off to be diagnosed. So as always, when you're seeking your professional, find out what's their experience with different demographics. And these demographics also affect with race as well, like cultural backgrounds, unconscious discrimination and unconscious bias is a real thing. So a survey of autistic adults essentially was getting together and said, what do they think would be the perfect way to be diagnosed? And all these things are cited, so you can see the little references up here if you're ever curious to find out more. They found that it is difficult for adults to access autism assessments. This was essentially agreed by all of them. Clinicians, which are essentially doctors who actually physically get their hands dirty, can find it difficult to identify autism in adults. Even they have admitted it themselves. An autism assessment team need more psychologists and occupational therapists. This has also been stated by the professionals. So when you ask why there's such a large waiting list, we're understaffed. It's simple as that. Most people, though, who have assessments do have a positive experience. The actual work we do is great. We just need more people to do it. And there are people who felt that the assessment wasn't age appropriate or wasn't gender appropriate. Now, as you can see, these numbers are quite low. They're worth keeping mindful of, but actually they're not that high. Still probably maybe higher than we would like, but not as high as maybe I would have thought. One of the most common ways of diagnosing autism is through the Autism Diagnostic Observational Schedule. And feel free to research this in your own time, but it kind of explains the process in more detail and what the assessors might be looking for. Definitely worth having a basic awareness of it if this is something you are looking to go down the route, even if it's for you or your children. There is a change in how it's getting done. So during the whole pandemic, obviously the waiting list just got ridiculous. So a lot of the time they are being done online now, and the NHS at least are using a thing called Telehealth, and a lot of other organizations use it as well. Simply, it just means like a video call rather than face-to-face. So if you are autistic, maybe this could be more daunting to you, or actually it might be better. So this is something you can also inquire whether or not it's something you want. So quick question to all of you. Would you want it to be online, or do you prefer face-to-face? We never used to have the option, but now it's a thing. So face-to-face is definitely easier, I would say, because autism is very much a communication condition, and you can get more information from face-to-face. But do know that if you live in a rural area and you might not have access to the certain professionals, doing it online is actually a tangible thing now that people are doing. And some people have such anxiety that maybe doing face-to-face just isn't appropriate. Oh, and it says face-to-face, I'm currently having mine online. Interesting, so you'd prefer face-to-face, but you're having it online. I'd love to know your experience. So a quick few points on having it online, if any of you do choose to go down that route, is that it mainly happened because of the pandemic. It's essentially a video call rather than in person. Just don't let the name fool you. Most people who had it done online were actually fine with it. Apparently it had quite a good satisfaction rate, which is interesting. You might, maybe that surprises you. However, the caveat is that clinicians were slightly less confident when delivering the assessment. So they were maybe a little bit less sure, probably because they didn't have all the information. Oh, Julia says online would mean that I'm in my own home, which would help me. Yeah, and I think, why not? I think there's room in the space for both types. But do know, when you're off to find how you're going to do it, it's an option. How to get an ASD assessment. Finally, Nat, you're getting to the point that I actually came here for. I know, but I thought the other things was quite good context. So if you have been diagnosed, please answer. If you haven't, maybe not on this question. Did you go to your GP who referred you? Were you self-referred? Did you go private straight away? Did you do it via your school? Or was there some other way that I haven't thought of yet? Most people typically will be at school, their teacher will mention it as a possibility, then you'll be referred to your GP. GP is by far the best way to start with. I wouldn't go private straight away. I'd use that as a secondary thing. If your GP is like, I really don't think you do, but you're like certain. But always know that you can get a second opinion. A lot of people don't realize that. Your GP isn't some overall god. They're a human being and they're prone to error like any of us are. So you can always seek a second opinion. And this is when maybe a self-referral might be a good option. So how to get it. This is typically, obviously it varies dramatically, but typically you would get referred for a diagnostic assessment by your GP. Your GP is like, I'm pretty confident you don't have any of these other things. Let's get you an assessment. You wait like a mini lifetime, but when it finally comes around, a psychiatrist or a clinical psychologist will often carry out the diagnostic assessment. Bear in mind, there are a few other people that can do it, but this is like the general rule. You'll then be informed of the results, typically during the appointment or after by phone or post. They can be quite quick at the turnaround, to be honest with you, but that was before the pandemic. And remember, you can always ask for a second opinion. And do not forget, you have the right to ask. Okay, what have we got here? We've got, I like having it done in the comfort of my home. However, I feel like not everyone gets picked up online, along with the fact that supporting evidence you might have is limited, as they may not want to see it because you're doing it online, even though it might help. That's a really good point, and thanks for sharing that. There are pros and cons, definitely, but you can't beat face-to-face for certain things. It takes 2.5 years, to get diagnosed. So that is the average. It sucks, but it's better that you are aware how long it can take. Okay, but how do you approach your GP? Just go and tell them, I believe I might have autism. These are my characteristics. Or I might do a thing called a screener test online, which we talk about a bit soon, which is also a good point. Say, okay, this screener said I'm quite likely to be on the spectrum. Is this something you think which would be worth following up a bit more? Wendy says, does it run in the family? Absolutely, it's hereditary, but do know it can skip generations. So maybe your child has it, you may not have it, but your parents may have it. It's not always like continuous. Amadeep says, can you ask for a second opinion from the people assessing you, or is it from your GP? You can ask for a second opinion from the people assessing you, but bear in mind they may not be that happy with it. But in terms of your, you can go elsewhere. I would say ask the people doing it first, because obviously you know them. But if they say no, go elsewhere. Ideally, it would be from the same organization, because then you wouldn't have to pay twice if you do have to pay, that is. The NHS, typically you're lucky to get one assessment. Having a second opinion might be pushing it, but there's always no harm in asking. Neela says, is there a way of getting a diagnostic for free? The tests are very expensive when you don't have a job/insurance. Well, outside of the UK, essentially there might be a few grants available. Organizations sometimes pay, but if you do not have a job and do not have insurance, no. Though there may be some, not as good, but some other options that hopefully I'll quickly touch upon. But when you want to choose, let's say you're like, okay, screw it, I'll go private, the NHS or whatever service isn't working for me. You then have to choose, who do I even go to? Because there isn't one way to diagnose. There's many ways to diagnose. And are they all equal? Well, according to the NHS's long-term plan, they acknowledge that children have to wait way too long to be diagnosed. So that's one reason why you might go a different route than public. But it's also important to know that there's very limited evidence that a particular way of getting diagnosed is better, whether or not you go to a psychiatrist, a psychologist, a private assessor, an educational specialist. There's not much evidence that one is particularly better than the other. So do not think that you're getting a better or a worse deal by going elsewhere. And they should, by the way, be completed within 13 weeks. This is the goal. The goal is 13 weeks. However, being referred to it can take up to 2.5 years. So if you are in any doubt you might be autistic, go now, go, because you might be waiting a long time. And 2.5 years, if you're already struggling, is a very long time. Yes, dyslexia. I know I focus a lot on autism just because it's a big subject. We've got, yes, it was brought up without me even knowing I was screened, with me being told I scored almost 100 points. Congratulations. However, the people assessing me think otherwise. It's interesting, isn't it? Yeah. Sometimes GPs prefer if they're the one to come up with the idea than you are, but we'll see. Anyway, moving on to dyslexia now. Dyslexia is very different from autism. And as such, getting diagnosed with dyslexia is very different. The biggest difference here is that the NHS will not do it. You can go to them, tell them you're dyslexic, and they might think otherwise, and you can get support for something else. But if they think it's dyslexia as well, you are not going to get the help. Now, my question to you quickly is, if you or someone you know was diagnosed with dyslexia, how did it happen? When I was originally diagnosed with ASD and I think dyspraxia at the time, but definitely ASD, that was done via the NHS. But when I was diagnosed with dyslexia, that had to be done via the school. Now, not all schools have the funding for it. And as such, they're a bit picky with who they choose. So they're not just going to be giving out these dyslexia assessments willy-nilly. They're very particular. And that's also important to know that not all, some schools will be quite reluctant to do it. Others might have particular budgets set aside for this. Okay, we've got a self-test online. Yes, sometimes you might just do a characteristic test, a screener. They're not official, but ultimately, maybe if you just want to understand your brain better, maybe that's good enough. We've got at college, had it done in college, got picked up in uni. Yes, universities are good. Normally establishments that have the funding available. Also, some workplaces will offer that as an option as well. And they're also private. Oh, a charity, that's great. Self-test. It's really good. To be honest, sharing best practice. I will not have all the answers, but maybe some of you will. Well, Sunjan says, I was diagnosed as an adult through Works occupational health because I couldn't do some of the tasks. Yeah, and that's great. So one, and this is only one, but one common way of diagnosing dyslexia is the Bangor Dyslexia Test, the BDT. And this is typically used for adults. So the Bangor test is a short screener which is used for broad ages ranges, which have been in use for about 3 decades. It might not be, it depends like what you call official, because that word is up for debate, but it's one that's very typically used. And I recommend researching Bangor Dyslexia Test if you are interested. It's quite good. They say that about 94% of people who do that test who come out as dyslexic, when taking a more official test, for example, turned out to be dyslexic. So that's pretty high odds. And it's often delivered through universities and schools. However, you can pay privately to have it done. I'm not going to advocate for anyone to pay here because I don't know anyone's situations, but I always know that it's an option if you're in a position to do so. And lastly, if you are going to do these these screeners online, always do independent research on the method, because not all of them are equal. Are they based in scientific evidence? Are other credible organizations using the similar approach? If one website that says dyslexia test doesn't mean dyslexia test to another site, they are not equal. Exceptional individuals, we have our own dyslexia tests. We make it very clear that they are not official tests. They are used as a conversation starter, but people still get confused. So it's really important to do your research. Moving on to ADHD. ADHD, attention deficit disorder, is something you can go to your GP about, but who was the first person to pick it up? Was it your friend? Was it your parents, school, GP? And these people, you always, weigh it up. Friends, I don't know. Everyone likes to call people, hell, you're a bit ADHD. Parents, they typically know. Or schools, they tend to have a good awareness. GPs typically won't pick it up because you only see them for like 10 minutes. So it's normally you go to them with you believe, and then they will take that further if they think so after they've asked a couple of questions. Elaine says, did Bangor with uni student support and was diagnosed, was to get a further face-to-face full assessment, but ended up giving up course before restrictions allowed face-to-face. Interesting. Now, a common test for ADHD, and as always, there's multiple ways of doing it, is the QbTest. And this is really interesting. You have like a headband, you have a camera, and it's a bit more interactive rather than just people talking to you. And clinicians can do it. It draws them multiple sources, and it can also involve having conversations with parents or teachers. It's not just yours. It's it's not just clinical. And a computer measures 3 core things. They measure your attention, they measure your impulsivity, your motor activities, and for all this, they'll give you a score. And they do take into consideration age and gender. So it's quite a modern way of having the assessment done, but more and more people are having it done this way. Oh, Sanjan says, not diagnosed, but since attending your talks, I have realized ADHD since childhood. Well, glad I could be of help. And it's up to you. You've got to weigh up the pros and cons on getting a diagnosis or not. Again, not here to advocate it. And the last one I'm going to do today is dyspraxia. So dyspraxia is about motor coordination, very common as dyslexia, but often goes amiss. So on this one, if you are neurodiverse, do you have any other neurodivergences? So basically say, you say you're dyslexic. Do you also have dyspraxia? Do you also have ADHD? I always like to know if you have one or the other. And the reason I ask this is it's very common to have multiple, like ridiculously. If you have one, you're very likely to have another one. And this might help you to fathom out if it's worthwhile being diagnosed for something else. Is there any benefit into it? Or if the support you're receiving for one, is that really the support you need, or could it be for something else? It's like for me, yes, I may technically have ASD, but dyslexia affects me a great deal, maybe even more. So it's worthwhile asking yourself. And a lot of people who are diagnosed with dyslexia, which is easier to be diagnosed for, typically get diagnosed for dyspraxia as well. Most people have both. Not everyone, but a lot of people. So definitely worth at least questioning, if you have one, whether or not something else might be connected. 2.8 is actually very average. That is, even though we've got a small sample size, it does correlate with the evidence. This was just a short test on dyspraxia. Essentially, we're always creating new ways of testing individuals. And a lot of the time people thought it was to do with flexibility. No, dyspraxic people, not affected. They might struggle with motor coordination, planning, memory. Flexibility wasn't part of it. So it's interesting to bust myths and to see facts from fiction. But all of these tests, by the way, are quite up to date. This one was 2013, but the other ones I mentioned was 2020 and 2021. So current new research is happening. And if you get nowhere, if you're like, you know what, Nat, I tried the GP, they are not listening, and you really rather not pay, but you feel you have no other choice, here's what I recommend. So for autism, the National Autism Society, or autism.org, they have a directory of loads of different places to go have an autism assessment. For ADHD, the ADHD Foundation is a good place. Now, beware, they do promote their own stuff, and so always take it with a grain of salt. Dyslexia, well, at EI, we don't personally do them, but we do have a partnership with Lexic, and so I can personally say we've worked with them before. The BDA, British Dyslexia Association, is the biggest one that most people go to. The other one, though, which is a lot wider and has more selection, is the Professional Association of Teachers and Students with Specific Learning Difficulties, PATOS. That's a really good one. Dyspraxia Foundation, they're the go-to. Not all these organizations actually do the assessments, but they will know people who will, much more than, say, I will on an individual basis. But the last one, and this again, UK-based, is the British Psychological Society. I recommend this the most. This, you have to be qualified to give these assessments. So make sure that someone is registered. If you go private or find someone who says, oh yeah, I can do that, make sure that they are registered under this body if you're in the UK. So a diagnostic assessment can only be carried out by a certified person qualified to assess. So the things that you need to be looking for if you find someone external or private is a psychologist specialized in specific learning difficulties. A normal psychologist isn't going to cut it. They have to be specialized. And they have to be registered with the Healthcare Practitioners Council, the HCPC. Different countries, it's going to be different. But do check this out in the UK at least. Make sure they're qualified. Otherwise, you're spending hundreds of pounds for something which isn't worth anything. The other one that can do it is a specialized teacher/assessor. You don't have to be a psychologist, but you will have to have a particular qualifications. And you want to look out for something called the AMBDA, or Assessment Practitioning Certificate, the APC. These are the things that you typically want to look for in the UK. Do not get hoodwinked. Make sure you go to the right person. If in doubt, get in contact with us and we can point you in the right direction. Bear in mind, we do not personally do the assessments. For us, we support people regardless of diagnosis. But as we mentioned, there's pros and cons to why you would want to get one. And now we're on to our online tests. For those of you who said, there's no way I can afford it, the GP and the doctors are awful, you can go on our website and do our online tests. We have them for ADHD, autism, dyspraxia, dyslexia, dyscalculia, OCD. We have them on everything. But please remember, as the test here says, please note, the results are not a diagnosis. They can be used to indicate whether or not you have traits that are neurodiverse if you scored highly, but then we recommend going to your GP. Please do not take these as gospel. I created these and I took the official ways of assessing each of these individual conditions, and I simplified it to put it in a form which was easy to understand. It is based on facts and science, but it is not official. I cannot stress that enough. But what you can do is do the test, print out the results or write down the questions and take them to your GP and let them know. And it will give them a starting point, a really good place to have a conversation. Okay, now here's the next thing. You want to get support, but you can't get an assessment for whatever reason. You don't have the money. In the UK, at least, you can have a workplace needs assessment. And this isn't being diagnosed, but it still gives you a report of how your mind works, what works for you, what doesn't work for you. And it's a really good free alternative to having an official diagnosis. You may not be able to say, I'm officially diagnosed by a medical professional, but what you can say is the UK government has recognised that I would benefit from additional support. So if you would be interested in that, get in contact. It's, like I said, it's not an official report in terms of being diagnostically diagnosed, but it is still something which you can use with employers. And under the Equality Act, they do have to take seriously. It can either complement a diagnosis or it can act as a better than nothing. Now, any questions before we leave today? Amy says, I see on your website that coaching with you guys is currently on hold. Any updates on this? Isoda, are you still around? I'd love it if you could chip in on this because she helps with our coaching.
So it's not on hold. We've just finished our current intake. So you just have to wait for the new intake, which will be happening, I think, in 2 months' time.
Cool. Thanks for that. So yeah, we don't want like rolling basis. We've got Laurie. If you have traits of several neurodiversities, what should you ask your GP for an assessment for? Good question. One, you should be honest with them and tell them about the multiple traits. And if you have an idea that it might be something, mention it to them because, again, they're not experts in everything. But also, if you have to choose, you have to look at the benefits that each one could offer you. So, for example, arguably, an autistic diagnosis is more valuable than a dyslexia one because the support you can get can be a lot higher and would also cover this type of support that you could benefit from being dyslexic. I don't think that's personally the right way to go about it, but if you had to pick where you wanted to put all your eggs, then put it in the one where it would have the biggest support on your life. This isn't like Pokemon. You don't want to catch them all, you know. Once you have the support and you feel confident, that will do. Oh, and Sunjan says, I can recommend the workplace needs assessment as it gives access to a grant for training and equipment. Nice. Lily says, any advice for trying to find an assessor for ASD who understands female presentations on autism? Not really. I would say the general advice I gave for finding it on autism will work. But when you are talking to the people, mention about from the female perspective. I don't know of any particular diagnostic kind of organization or group that only works with women. Personally, I think it's a great idea, but I don't know any, I'm afraid. And the question we got, who conducts the workplace assessments and how to apply? That's such a good question. So at Exceptional Individuals, we do them, and it's our team who are experts in the assessments. We've got people who are qualified in them, and they are also neurodiverse themselves. So it's very much experts by experience with years of experience. If you go via the government directly, it will normally be with one of their partners. Bear in mind that these individuals typically will have a disability, but it might not necessarily be neurodiverse. So you can go to so many places and get them done. Eventually, it all goes via the government. If you go public, if you go private, it will be an independent assessor. Obviously, I would recommend us if you're neurodiverse, but you are free to go anywhere. If you like today, if you wanted to rewatch it because, you know, there was a lot of information, if there were things that you missed, all you have to do is go to our YouTube channel, just type in Exceptional Individuals and smash that subscribe button. And we have sessions and workshops on so many different things. And our next webinar, which is always good to kind of get people excited, is the comorbidity of neurodiversity. So what does it mean to have multiple conditions? How does one affect the other? So really interesting. Then we've got, am I synesthetic? Can you taste color? Can you feel it? a brief history of hidden disabilities on June the 23rd. And essentially, we have a whole heap of really interesting webinars coming up. So please do check them out and sign up ahead of time if you're able to. We also have online communities such as our Autism Opportunities community on Facebook, in Dyslexia, where we try to post jobs and just point you in the right direction if we're able to. And I'm all out of breath because I've spoken loads, but if you do have further questions, get in contact. My name's been Nat, just email me, nat@accept.co.uk, or drop us a general email at admin, and we'll get in contact. But thank you so much for attending today. I hope you found it useful. I know it's a minefield. I know it's seems mission impossible, but it really can benefit you, depending, and the earlier you get it done, the better. Don't feel demotivated from today. See it as the challenge, but you appreciate the benefit it can give you if you think it's the right decision for you. But yeah, that's everything for today. Thank you all for coming. Love having you as always, and enjoy the rest of your Thursday. All right, bye all.